Um, so we will be looking at is how we can develop organizational forms that act as seeds for a just city. And in Berlin, there has been a rich variety of approaches that have been developed and also started to being implemented here. I'm Andre, I'm part of the Stadtbodenstiftung, which is an initiative setting up a community land trust here in Berlin. And I will share our experiences in developing a legal framework for a democratic land bank that unlocks land for solidarity-based projects. Before I was active here in the Community Land Trust Initiative, I was part of a neighborhood group in London trying to set up a community land trust to build affordable community-led housing. And also, when I then came to Berlin, I started getting very quickly into tenant activism, just actually also around the house where I was living, as it's kind of a topic of which engulfs us everywhere. Even now that you come into trust, you see the scaffolding in front and already a sign for modernizations to push certain rents up. So the Community Land Trust Berlin, we looking into a new type of organization for long-term stewardship of our cities. The CLT structure is gaining momentum in several cities in Europe and several countries, from England to Brussels and Belgium, to also we are trying to bring it here into Berlin. And we are really doing this work of transforming this idea, this framework of the CLT for the German, but also in particular the Berlin context with its unique assemblage of existing actors, but also understandings of how we can relate to our buildings, to our city. So, yeah, this is the Stadtbodenstiftung, which we have founded, or which we are in the process of founding. So, what's the story behind, or why are we doing this? So, we are confronted here in Berlin. Has been happening over the last 30 years. So ownership of land and housing has massively changed in that time. I mean, just starting on the one hand with East Berlin, where after the fall of the wall, there has been a huge wave of privatization. So on the one hand, there was a restitution to the owners before socialization in East Germany, but there was also a wider privatization wave across all of Berlin, selling off state-owned land and municipal housing to multinational corporations. And at the same time, the ownership of private-owned tenement housing, like these typical Berlin houses with maybe 30 flats, has also been changing. So away from upper or middle-class individuals who only owned one or two houses, which were like lawyer families, which at least had a face or could be contacted by the residents and the neighbors. This is changing into a situation where houses are packed into limited companies and being traded like a financial good. And these companies are then registered in tax havens, and there's no clear understanding anymore who's actually behind these houses, who are actually the ownership. So the people who make decisions about the houses have, in many cases, never even physically been in the house. And this situation is also being challenged very strongly all across Berlin. So there are tenant initiatives and cultural projects and many other groups who are fighting to get back control in order to make decisions about the places they use, they live or use for commercially or for projects. And also to get back control over what's happening in their neighborhoods. And this picture comes from a very kind of important struggle in the Lausitzer Straße in Kreuzberg, where there's a lot of small businesses, but cultural, also very important cultural anti-racist organizations, and which are fighting against the landlord, which is trying to sell the house for a very high price, which would lead to their displacement. And they're trying to find solutions, could be with the community land trust or also with political alliance with the Senate of Berlin. And when we think about what we think as a solution for these kind of struggles, or as one of the instruments which we want to bring into Berlin, we are inspired by the community land trust structure. And the structure did originate in the civil rights movement in the US in order to secure independency for African Americans by taking over land in community-run organizations. And these community-run organizations were the CLTs. The formation of these organizations actually was inspired from a much larger tradition, like, the understanding land as a commons, which has been the norm situation for many centuries. Until the very recent past, it has been just the common situation. And they took inspiration from the kibbutz movement in Israel or from garden cities in England. And now thinking about how can we bring back this normal of land as a commons into our current legal framework, which is a framework for private land ownership. So the CLT itself is an organization that has three main principles, one can say. The one is the topic of community. So it is a community-led organization, which has a big principle in community organizing. It's about land. So the organization owns land. And it's about trust. Trust in the sense of a trusteeship of the land to keep it for a social purpose. So, for example, for people who are being pushed out by speculative markets from the places they call home, the places they live in, or the places they need for survival. So we were inspired by this and brought the community land trust idea into the German context. So we are an initiative that is a mix of many different people. So in our group, there are people from neighborhood initiatives. There are people who've working professionally or in other ways in cooperatives, setting up cooperatives or running big cooperatives. There are people from more city activism perspectives, or people from politics, or people who were involved in kind of ethical finance. And for us, the basic principles here of bringing this construction here is that it's about a local organization, the Community Land Trust. It is limited to a locality. It's about Berlin. It has a social purpose, so it's specifically about providing spaces for people who are being pushed out by the market or discriminated against by the market forces, by the current situation. Like could be little shops, could be social institutions, could be people with low incomes or people who are in other ways discriminated by the market. And it's a democratically run organization, which actually works in a tripartite way, which I will explain later, balancing the interest between people using the space, people living in the neighborhood, and also, as a third, people from the wider public. Yeah. So, for today, talking about the community lands, I will specifically focus on this topic of ownership. So what is the role of ownership in our model? And there are basically two ways where ownership matters for us. The one is in the concrete ownership arrangements around the houses and buildings and the land which is part of the community land trust. The second one is about the ownership of the organization itself. So I will start with the first one, like understanding how the organization is structured in the houses themselves. So we have, on the one hand, I will just start with like kind of getting into this few terms here. So like ownership is really the legal title to the property. So it's the right to exclude other from its use and actually to extract value from the property. So it could be an individual owner of a tenement house, or the legal person, like a cooperative, or a non-profit organization could it also be, or a profit-driven, a limited company. And then there's the topic of possession. So possession, this is about who actually uses the spaces. So in a tenant, if you're a tenant, you're actually possessing the flat. You are using it, and you can exclude others from coming into your flat. You can create the safe space for you. So this is another layer, the layer of possession, of actually using the space. And this is very common in these two concepts in the way we engage with buildings in our city. What we add as a new layer is the layer of trusteeship. So we understand that trusteeship, that is, you're owning something not directly, but you're managing something as if you would be owning it for a certain purpose. So you're being entrusted with a certain asset. And this is what we're adding with the idea of a community land trust, which acts as a trustee for the land, so in order to keep it for a common good use in the long term. So when we talk about the Berlin context, we also talk about that there have been many hundreds and thousands of people who have been developing other ways of dealing with the city, of kind of common good oriented ownership models. And so I will talk about a few and kind of put the community land trust into concept here, how it works. So we think the community land trust, the CLT, can act as a platform with a diverse set of ownership models on top of its land. In this way, the community land trust enables solidarity between the projects and at the same time guarantees social criteria and openness of the projects. So when we look at the different forms here of non-speculative housing models, here, for example, we have in Berlin housing projects. So they can often come from, or in Berlin there was a history of squatting, where housing projects developed from squatted housing. And some of these houses work very well still, after 30, 40 years. But some of them can also sometimes become very self-centered, so very close to people from different social circles, not very responsive to neighborhood needs, or a new generation, maybe not as idealistic as the first generation, gets tempted to sell the project for a profit. Topic of municipal housing companies, they are a very important actor in Berlin, own almost a fifth of the housing stock, and they are very good providers of affordable housing for a wide variety of people. However, in the past, the housing stock has also been up for discussion. It has been sold off in the 2000s and 90s in Berlin, like tens and thousands of public housing has been sold. So they can be the victim of political changes. And also, if you ever deal with them, you quickly realize that neighborhoods and tenants really have not much say in them. It's very difficult to engage with them because of their sheer size and the way they make their decisions. And another model which is active here in Berlin, that's the model of large housing cooperatives. So they actually own about 10% of Berlin housing. But there can be problems, and that has been seen that some of the older cooperatives, I mean, they have been there for 100 years or longer, like since the time of the Weimar Republic. Their self-interest has decoupled from public interest. So this can be visible, for example, in their very broad lobbying against the Berlin rental freeze. So like a solution which was supposed to work for all of the residents in Berlin, all tenants, they were lobbying against because it was not working with their own self-interest. So they were like preserving them before the others. So while the residents in cooperatives have secure tenancies, it's not always clear that the assets of the cooperatives are used in solidarity with the wider public. And lastly, we also have land trusts in Germany. There are two land trusts which are active, Edith Marien and Foundation Trias. And they are also effective in taking land out of the market. However, they're not interested, or they're built on a different purpose. They're not able to build democratic ownership of the foundation itself, because they're also not locally bound to a certain area. And thus, they can be very distant from local needs and not listening much to the users and the neighborhoods. So when we think about our proposal, we building the community land trust as a platform for various forms of these common good-oriented ownerships on top. And I think that, for example, if housing projects are on top of the community land trust, they have to adhere to certain criteria for example, in allocating the housing. So they have to have a certain openness to people which are not in their immediate circles. We also at the same time secure them at privatization in the future. So cooperatives can privatize, so all the members can decide we sell the whole of our house. So we can prevent this through this control with the community land trust. And in cooperatives, we can bring in a solidarity aspect of continuous payments of funds, solidarity fund on top of the community land trust, which then can take more houses and more land out of the market. And the main principle to make this happen for us is creating a mixed ownership through the leasehold model. So what we use is what the community land trust principle is that ownership is split apart. So this leads to the fact that many different actors have rights and are involved in certain decisions. So the main leasehold contract happens between the land, like separating the ownership of the land from the ownership of the house. So the land itself is owned by the community land trust, and it's then giving a long-term leasehold contract, like 99 years, to a different organization, like a cooperative, which manages the housing. And in this leasehold contract, the common good criteria and like criteria talking about in what kind of decisions neighborhood has to be consulted, what kind of parts of the housing has to be allocated to people who are discriminated by the market in specific ways. All this is kind of secured through the leasehold contract in perpetuity. And at the same time, the cooperative and the people living have in this area like still a lot of freedom to make the decision of how to use the house for themselves. So another aspect, which is also through this separation of ownership, is the topic of leasehold fees. So the rent is paid to the house to finance the management organization, which then pays a leasehold fee for the land, which uses the trust in the beginning to repay the debt, and later for solidarity finance to make new projects happen. So in this way, we're creating this ownership arrangement. We're basically creating it in a legal setting where there's just private or state ownership, but by splitting it up, the different levels of ownership and breaking up certain windows and rights for other people to engage on how the asset is used, we are trying to create a framework for the third aspect, for kind of something that is managed as a commons. So there's always an ambiguity in this. So we, on the one hand, use legal arrangements to secure the main goals of the organization, like that it's never going to come back into the speculative market again, and that there's a certain amount of decision-making for example, commercial areas attributed to neighborhood, etc. But at the same time, we're leaving the legal structure open enough to be adaptable to local needs and changing times, so that there's a democratic field there where people can use the organization. So this is kind of the balance between the things we manage. And the second aspect where ownership matters for us, this is in the way the organization is owned. So so on the one hand, we can zoom into arrangement at specific buildings, what we did before, and look at the ownership structures there. And here now, as a second step, we'll also look at how the ownership is constructed by looking at the entire organization itself. And as a background, we are using the legal form of a foundation in German law. And the foundation is endowed with capital and has to use it in order to further a specific purpose, which is defined in the beginning, and it can very hardly ever be changed. And if you look at it very clear, then you understand the foundation itself. It's not like a limited company or like a association or a cooperative. It's not an organization that is defined by its members, but it's actually capital that owns itself. It's assets which are lost of that idea that they are owned by somebody who decides what to do best for them. No, this is defined by the founding statutes. So there's a trusteeship over the asset, and in setting up the organization, we are oriented at the Committeelandschaft principle of having these three parities to bringing in kind of a multi-stakeholdership into our setup. So we have a third of the seats in the board of trustees, which come from the projects and are residents or maybe commercial tenants. Then another third of the seats in the board of trustees comes from the neighborhoods. So there are specific ways where there could be neighborhood forums where people can send representatives or say that certain neighborhood initiatives should act as representatives for them in the board of trustees of the foundation. And as a third aspect, we want to bring in the public interest, so citywide interest, which goes beyond the specific housing or the specific neighborhoods. And we do this by two terms, by on the one hand bringing in various forms of experts for common good oriented city development. That could be from scholars which are active in city politics, activism, to people working in cooperatives or people representing certain needs, for example, refugees in need of adequate housing situations. And so they kind of have an interest which is not for a local neighborhood, but which is for the whole city. We also bring in somebody from public bodies, like the Senate or the Land of Berlin or a specific district, which can send a person and to have a seat. And also we have another seat for the various donors who can all send or nominate a specific person, that's like from private donors. And through this arrangement, we kind of from the beginning create a conflict of interest between these various parities. So like the users, the neighborhood, and also public interest. And this is the idea of steering that that none of these factions start using the foundation to act in their own, solely in their own interest. And the main technology, I would say, to use about securing this framework is law and our organizational culture. So, so we define various legal documents in order to define and secure our aims in the long term while still make them adaptable if needed in a democratic decision-making way. So I will now talk a bit about more detail about the decisions we made in the process and how we went about securing our various principles. I mean, obviously we started with a quite wider vision, being maybe closer to certain projects we've seen in other contexts, and then try to understand actually how does it work in the German legal context and how can we secure the aims and goals we see in this current context. Because as a starting point, because in the way what we did, we wanted to have association, like a tenant association or like an association which is democratic, but acts like a foundation. So like is long-term oriented, like a foundation which can last over many decades or centuries or even longer. And this hybrid of organizational formats, which is like between an association and a foundation, there is no perfect legal form here. So we had to really discuss with lawyers and with like authorities what is actually possible, what can we craft here. So when we looked at our principles, like one of the important principles is that there's an asset lock, so that the land itself, which is once, as soon as it's in the foundation, it's then cannot get out of it and come back onto the speculative market. And the one point where we secure this is through our statutes, the bylaws, and where it's defined how we can use our assets and that we cannot just sell off the land which we once acquired. And this is actually secured by a regulatory body, the Stiftungsaufsicht, which exists in order to make sure that foundations act according to their statutes, which is specific to this legal form. At the same time, especially with the Stiftungsaufsicht, we had lots of discussions of how we want to democratize our organization, and that's the second body, where they said you cannot write many of the things we wanted to have into our statutes because it's a foundation, it's not a membership body. So we went about the democratization only by securing the most important things in the statutes itself, and then go about using a community bylaws or community statute, which the membership body of the organization can give itself, which then is not being checked by the Stiftungsaufsicht, but still can secure our aims of democratization. And then the next principle, which was important for us, is a community-oriented use of buildings, so that, for example, commercial spaces are not being rented out to the organization which pays the highest price, but actually according to criteria what is needed in specific neighborhoods, where there can be very different forms of neighborhood engagement or mobilization in making these decisions. And this is enforced through leasehold contracts. So the foundation owns the land and then gives these leasehold contracts to the managing organization, where the use or the decision-making is defined in certain ways. And this is secured through the legal system itself and has these very long-running contracts, which are like, can be 99 years. And lastly, the principles of like securing the land grant for the local community and for solidarity among projects. And this is enshrined by the non-profit status, Gemeinnützigkeit in German. This at the same time as being our accounts will be always checked by the finance authority in Germany, making sure where the funds being used, etc. So through all these various, using these various organizations and legal documents, we have the aim of building an organization which in the very long term, like if we not just look at like in 5 years or 10 years, but actually look at like 20 or 30 years, can stay true to the values it wants to see in the way we deal with the city. While still a lot of things can change, priorities, etc., but still the main principles need to be locked in a way that certain fleeting majorities cannot change them for personal gain or profit of certain interest groups. And we struggled with fitting our vision into this legally possible way. And also in this process, we learned that this can be different from state to state. So we talk with other foundations which realize that there are humans sitting in these authorities and they make different situations. While one thing can be legally done in one state, another state says, oh no, this is not legally possible, even though they look at the same laws. It's just the way the person interprets interprets the laws. So even sometimes it's people working in specific departments. So it's very interesting to use this like tool of law, which can be very fixed, but also has a lot of flexibility in a sense, which is an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. So it's really about playing this game. And just rounding up, I mean, we are in the process of setting up this foundation, this first community land trust in Berlin. And we have set up kind of we brought clarity to all the types of legal organizations. And we're also now in the process of building the financial momentum to be able to buy, to acquire the first projects. And that's where we're looking for further support, etc., and kind of trying to show how can we differently relate to the city and how can we understand the land in the city and the building in the city as a commons where we all have a say and a right to. Yeah, that's for the introduction for the Community Land Trust.